What's up, everybody? We're here for another episode of Stark Naked Radio. I'm here, Tyler Mounts, with my friend
Paul Giamatti,
a.k.a. Mr. Moffidy, Amir Mofidi. We're generally here, but there's someone else with us today who's not generally here, and we are grateful to have him here, and that is Mr. Rolandas Mensikovas. Rolandas, good to see you.
What's up, guys?
We have been seeing you because you've been visiting us for the past week or so. But we get to work with you, and we've known you for a long time. For those of you that don't know, Rolandas is the wizard behind the curtain, or the guy behind the curtain. You know what I'm talking about?
Not that way. Not the guy behind the curtain.
It's a Wizard of Oz, reference that fell flat on his face.
Sorry. But what that means is Rolandas is the genius behind the individualized and highly customized workouts for our students here at Stark. So if you have training, if you're training at Stark and you have a customized workout program written for you, it means that Rolandas was the one who designed it. And he is a super genius. He knows lots of stuff about lots of stuff, but specifically one of the areas of his, well, first of all, where are you coming from, Rolandas? Like, where did you come visit us from?
I came from Cape Town.
From Cape Town, South Africa.
He was an extra in the movie District 9.
Yeah.
Also Safe House.
Yeah.
That was the guy who was getting waterboarded. Yep. That was me.
So, obviously, we're always grateful when you come visit us, and it would be foolish of us not to squeeze you for some helpful information regarding our health and performance. We have been talking about body composition for the last 3 weeks. We're moving on because we don't care about body composition anymore. And now all we care about is mobility. Now, I understand that people's perception of what mobility means can vary greatly. And so you can share with us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, what mobility means to you.
So I want to bring it back just a little bit to what Amir said a couple of podcasts ago. I think there was a great idea of him getting a bit of a baseline understanding of where things are, what's important, what's not important, starting at some sort of a assessment point. And a lot of people will miss the critical importance of ability to move, or movement ability, in the chase for performance outcome, be it a weight loss, athletic performance. And to me, it's an equivalent of loading the system that's already being loaded quite heavily. So training, add better training, add fancier training, add a different programming, add more loads, chains, bands, whatever, without ability to execute the motion properly. So we're putting screws on tighter on the system instead of unwinding the system and taking the handbrake off. Mm-hmm. This way we can improve performance without changing the training, in a sense, and sometimes doing even less training or no training, protecting the person against themselves. So to me, the body composition, or the last number of podcasts that were there, the physical part of body composition change has to start with your ability to move, or your mobility or movement ability. Because if you can't do work, if you can't do enough mechanical work, you can't really force the body into adaptation. If you can't force the body into adaptation, normally you're going to break the body, because you have a very narrow window of opportunities to execute the motion. So people come in and say, I can do the leg press, but I cannot do the squat, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's a big concern to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, we all know Paul Chek's book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, right? I think of it as regardless of what the book says, he's kind of in the title, he's implying that being healthy is the end, and eating and moving are the means by which we get there. And so there's, to your point, there's not really any version of optimal health without proper nutrition and proper movement. So, again, the movement is also a means to changing body composition. It's a means to improving cardiovascular fitness. It's a means to a lot of different things that fall under the umbrella of health. But that you're right. That is,
the movement is something we're fundamentally meant to do.
Yeah.
We are designed to move, and in the 21st century, in an industrialized world, we move less and less and less, and move more and more linearly, and more in a very streamlined, very structured manner in terms of programming. So you go to very nice facility with some sort of orange, color built into it, or some other color built into it, and you will be put through very linear movement patterns that cause very linear countable calorie expense or something to that extent, and yet it teaches you nothing.
I just got the orange reference.
Cool. Welcome back.
I thought he was talking shit on us.
I didn't take. I
was like, we have orange in our cars.
I didn't take my fish oil this morning.
So the idea is that somehow simple linear patterns will create certain energy expenditure, and as such will cause a body composition change. Is reductionist at best, because it's a couple occasions a week, and then you've got nowhere else to go because you sit on your butt, you sit on your chair, you sit in your car. And when you go to those places, the movement ability is so narrow that you can only do a couple of things and poorly. So your longevity is very, very short from a stress point of view, from a mechanical point of view, so break down faster than you can heal. And in about 6 months, you have to quit because you hurt. So then you go end up doing yoga to relieve those symptoms, and your movement repertoire never expands really. So to me, as I'm getting older, over 4 decades bounce around this world, I realize more and more most of the people that we deal with are about my age or a little bit older. There's nothing better than experience for yourself how bad situation can get, and how important it is to restore prerequisites before you go and stack something on top of it.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like if you ask people, like if their ability to move or improve quality of movement is something they want in their goals, that doesn't come up a lot.
People don't think
when we don't think about it. But if you, on the flip side of things, asked them like, what would you feel if you lost the ability to move in certain capacity? Like you couldn't bend over, you couldn't like reach above your head and things like that.
And most of people already do. They just don't realize it because there's no opportunity for them to test it. As soon as they come out either to our place here or they go into a bit of a unstructured environment and they have to climb some odd place, to go to Europe and they have to climb a lot of stairs or move in a very narrow passage or do something that it's outside of driving and walking around the shopping mall, then all bets are off at that point. So you need to have a reality check, and for most of us, there isn't one.
Yeah.
Well, unless you have a little kids or something like that, and you're slightly older, and you realize, damn, I can't even get down to play with my kid, or I can't pick them up, my back hurts, or my shoulders hurt, or I can't carry them for more than 30 seconds, and I'm exhausted, and I'm huffing and puffing up the hill.
In the 70s and 80s, it was can you touch your toes, sit and reach test at school, and then the more sophisticated screens came out, like the overhead squat test, and then the FMS screen, which some of you might be familiar with, some of you not. But how would someone start kind of figuring out where their flexibility limits are without going to an orange facility, or having to go to Europe? Like, how does someone know, aside from the feeling of being tight, where their limitations are and where they should focus?
So let's go back to Tyler's original question. What's the flexibility versus mobility, or what's the definition of it? So to me, one of them is passive, one of them is active. Flexibility is something that is able to flex, and that's about it. It's uncontrolled.
And when you say flex, you don't mean like flexing your biceps in a mirror, right?
Kind of, but in the opposite direction. So extend your biceps fully.
Okay.
Can your elbow extend fully? If you lie down on a table and somebody stretches you put your leg over your head and you're in a hamstring stretch, you got a great flexibility. That's true. The tissues are flexible enough. But can that person do a split? Almost always is never the case. So Jean-Claude Van Damme would be a great example. His flexibility in the movies in the past is amazing. You'll do splits, no problem.
You can do it now still.
Yeah, but his mobility is also very good because he can do overhead kick or something like that where his leg is almost vertical and control it. So he has strength in the positions of demand. That's to me a definition of mobility. Being able to move in and out of positions with control versus inactively being put in there and having no control. Because what you have to realize is that body will only allow you to get into certain positions if he can do so on two thoughts. Is it safe to be there? Do I have strength to get in and out? And have I been there before? If those two are not satisfied, those two questions not satisfied, body won't let you go. So a lot of people will say, well, look, I can't bend down. I don't have flexibility in there. Well, one, you haven't been there in a long, long time. You haven't really bent down. So you don't have exposure to the movement pattern. But two, you have no strength to control the loads, be it your own, be an external load. So the brain says, no, you can't go there because you can't get out. I haven't been exposed to it. I'm afraid. So the flexibility and mobility restrictions are almost never structural. They're not because your hamstrings are tight.
Like they're not actually shorter.
It's not the flesh.
No,
right?
it's almost always it's a nervous system protection mechanism,
Right.
and that comes from structures that talk to the nervous system. For example, your capsule will talk to the brain first, and if the capsule is tight, it doesn't matter how much you stretch superficial tissues, quads, hamstrings, whatever. If the capsule is tight and it doesn't have a good movement ability,
In the joint capsule.
yeah, then the brain will say, look, my joint is tight. It doesn't matter, so I will tighten up the tissues because otherwise joint is vulnerable. It's a protection mechanism.
Am I on?
Yeah, you're still on.
It's like it's a self-protective mechanism, right? Like when the seatbelt grabs and prevents you from moving forward, it's trying to protect you
because car knows you're going to crash into the head
as part of it. You
dashboard.
brake too sharply or something and so on.
Totally.
So I heard a definition of mobility that I kind of like, unless you tell me it's not very good, and then I'll abandon it completely. But this idea that mobility is a combination of flexibility and stability. So, because again, I think to your point, it's wrong to associate flexibility, like can I touch my toes, with the ability to move, which is mobility. But then to your point, like you need the strength in that position is like the stability. So you have people who, I think of people on the high end of the ligamentous laxity scale, right? Like people that have like Ehlers-Danlos and other things that allow for what seems like a high level of flexibility, but their ability to actually move well isn't all that high because they lack the stability. So it's, people can sometimes fall different places on that spectrum.
I would agree. I think that stability has to come from ability to control actively the stability part, because if it's a bone-on-bone closure of stability, then it's a passive stability, right? We have plenty of those people can hold a plank for 42 minutes, not because they're strong, but because the spine is in a fully closed bone-on-bone and they're just hanging off the ligament system. No more active system participation. You raise the hips, you get the under better organization, and suddenly it just shakes and quakes in 60 seconds flat. So as long as that stability is not acquired by some sort of a bony closure and just sort of jamming the moving segments together, then sure, I agree with that.
Let's talk about training. So obviously people who, whether for the sake of improved mobility or for the sake of fat loss, decide they want to go to the gym and work out. Now, understanding that the ability to move is going to be integral to their body composition goals or whatever their goals are. Like, again, we said there's no version of health, however you define it, where movement isn't a part of that. What are people going to need to consider, or how are people going to optimize their training for healthy movement? And obviously I know that's a question, but walk us through the process. Factors to consider, steps in the process, assessments, things they need to look at.
So I guess you got to start at the beginning. Who are you? What kind of cat you are? What's your, background historically? You're an athlete. You're not an athlete. Are you male or a female? That's important. What age you are, because the tissues will get worse with age, or in the middle, somewhere between them, somewhere. If you start accounting for sex, age, movement experience, injury history, nutritional situation, the tissue hydration status, movement experience in terms of exposure, how that person has grown up, have they played any sports, what kind of sports they played, do they have a variety of life experiences or not, are they sort of right-handed, right leg marcher, or they know what it looks like to actually cross over the midline. That will dictate a lot of things that you can and cannot do to that person right out of the gate. And if the person has been hurt, they're a desk jockey, they been overweight all their life. They did nothing athletically. They have hurt a number of times, bilateral Achilles tear, stepping off the curb. Then that person unfortunately goes on the spectrum of you're probably gonna have to spend 5 times the amount of time in terms of restoring your ability to move and changing the connective tissue state than the person who's moving well and only needs some optimization. So the big problem is that you have to identify that you can or cannot do certain things, which comes back to you, Amir, question, how do you test on things? So pick. I don't mind. You can pick FMS, you can pick SFMA, break it down. You can look at, dancing on one foot. I don't care, but you have some sort of a standard that you can say, okay, in my head, when we do intakes in here, Tyler, right? You do the intakes here. So does the person look like they can squat? Body weight, unloaded. Forget about the arms overhead to begin with, but can they squat? If they can't squat, that's a fundamental movement pattern that's missing, and most of life is about squatting, or is about bending, is about crawling, getting in and out. Try to get in and out of the car without squatting. I don't know the car yet. That seats that will be coming. When the seats come out, you just plop back, and then the seat will go back.
I actually dive headfirst in through the window.
I have a standing car.
I mean, that's because you have a good mobility, So you're on a Segway. That's your standing car.
Yeah.
So
I'm a mall cop on the weekends.
If you don't have that, we're losing something that is of great magnitude because that person can't squat at the fundamental life level. Now we can't load them really in the gym safely potentially because of multitude of reasons. Can they do a push-up? Can they do a split leg position of some sort? Do they have a minimum projection? If they don't, whatever you choose, you kind of say, okay, they should be meeting a minimum of this: cardiovascular health, mobility, some sort of health markers. If they don't have that, then we have to be careful, and we have to take them sometimes very, very far back. Most people don't realize that in order to truly make a dent in that, you almost have to stop everything else. Unfortunately, and examples are clear. It's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. If I ask you, what sports you would associate with the great, call it flexibility, mobility that you can think of that are out there, what sports would come to your mind?
Gymnastics.
All right, perfect. So now gymnastics, what type of training do gymnasts do that you think will come to your mind when you think how the gymnast training looks? Say a female gymnast, what do they do?
They do a lot of jumping, running, crawling.
And they stretch.
You see
stretch hours, not 5 minutes, a little bit of a sort of roll foam roller, do 10 reps of leg swings, and then suddenly I'm very flexible. Legitimately, if you look at any gymnastic schools, maybe it's a 40% skill work, and the rest is a capacity building in terms of movement ability. And there's no two ways about it. People say, oh, it's bad. It doesn't matter. If your goal is to be amazing at something, you have to have a massive amount of time spent in that. Now, we're not going to turn gymnasts into our gym, people into gymnasts. But the reality is that everything else you do in life is tightening you up, is turning those screws tighter. And when people come in and we battle with them to do 10-minute warm-up and a couple of minutes of stretching, it's very, very hard. I would say almost impossible to win that battle because there's never enough questions for the nervous system to say, okay, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? You want this. And unfortunately, you only have a finite amount of time, so you got to reallocate the time. You have to drop almost all of the training or to put it on the back burner to minimize it, and then your workout might be 40 minutes of stretching and 12 minutes of lifting or 50 minutes of lifting because your goal is to improve mobility, not to get tighter and get worse.
Well, it's interesting that you guys brought up gymnastics because the weightlifters, these are legitimately the strongest men in the world, or at least the most powerful men in the world. In Russia and in China, they are able to do the splits, believe it or not. Like Dmitry Klokov, silver medalist in London, I think it was London, and the Chinese weightlifters who are smaller, they are routinely on Instagram doing the splits. People like their coaches like standing on their shoulders, and so even with a very strength and power based goal, it is a fundamental part. Like they're doing that as much as they are doing their weightlifting. And
they spend a fair amount of time stretching. You see Klokov's warm up. It's a quasi,
it's like ballet almost.
Kind of torture. Like
it's like ballet almost. It's this medieval getting to that point of where the stretching is just as painful as the training.
But they do have a very specific warm-up and very specific stretch as well. So they're not going to spend time on middle splits. They're going to spend the time more in the front to back splits or something like that. On the general life, front, almost everything is bad. So we got bad shoulders, we have a bad hips, we have a bad ankles, we have a bad knees, we have a bad elbows, we have a bad neck, we have a bad back, and everything in between those joints that I didn't mention yet. So probably nose is okay.
So if we can do this, because I there's kind of like a sliding scale, right? Where on the far end you have what like corrective work, like what you're talking about. Like you have people who can't move, haven't moved.
So they have a flexibility of a rock.
Yeah, exactly. So they need help bad, right? And then you have like some of the more athletic population, potentially younger population, people who are well trained, people who have invested over the years in mobility and things like that. So if we were to kind of like split the discussion in, because obviously those are you address those two people way differently, right? In terms of like how you're going to handle them. So like, let's kind of tackle one segment of the population first, which is like the rocks. Like the people who like the
bricks and rocks.
Their idea of a squat is unlocking their knees. Like those kind of people. And then we'll talk more about like on the more performance. So that, oversimplification, but you have mobility for corrective purposes and you have mobility for performance purposes. So let's start with the rocks and the people who to not be PC that suck. From a movement standpoint.
For the most part, most of us to some extent, depending on the joint. Now, so for these people, and you get a lot of pushback on this in the fitness community, people be bagging on this steady stretching, long stretches. They're like, oh, this reduces performance, that reduces performance. Like, what do I care? The guy has no performance. Like, you can't do anything, so what are we going to lose?
Yeah, the
minus out of zero? There's nowhere to go.
The 52-year-old, like, business guy who is like, oh yeah, but if I stretch too much, my vertical is going to go down.
Right. I mean, your vertical is over sideways credit card anyway, so it doesn't matter at this point. And also, I mean, that's a good point. Like, it's a sound bite. So the research says, sure, long stretches will reduce your power output, but it's a minuscule, relatively speaking. I mean, it's not Olympic weightlifting final.
Yeah, you're not a shot putter. About. Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't matter if you drop the top power output by 7%. You can't even get to 20% of your power output because you're so rock-like. So that doesn't matter. 2, this person has no training experience and no goal of being that. So that doesn't matter either. What is his goal? His goal is to get better, which means you have to spend time on it, which means you go back to gymnastics 101. You spend time in long, steady stretches first. That's a passive stretching. You got to get tissues to unwind. The brain has to know that you keep asking it to get into lengthened position passively first. Once you've accomplished enough of that, and there's some guidelines to it, it's a longer stretch than what you think. It's probably shorter than what most people will do. Then you can start loading the stretches. So then we start actively having contractions against yourself, in the direction. It's almost like, think of it as PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. When you contract the opposite muscle to stretch it, in the opposite direction.
So for people, that's like you're stretching your hamstring and then you push down. And then you let it go again.
That's a neurological trickery. You train the brain. You trick the brain into temporary relaxation a little bit to get extra range, but that takes time. First of all, the brain has to know that the connective tissue starts to unwind after longer time under stretching, and that could be weeks into months. Then you start building. Now we're starting on the scale. We're sliding on the scales now. So you start loading the tissues, and now the tissues start to adapt. They become stronger in the loaded position. So now that person becomes able to control that new position with the newly acquired strength. And that can be transferred further into fully loaded stretching, fully strength-based flexibility sort of restoration, where the squat becomes a restoration for your mobility, where single leg stuff becomes heavy loaded deadlifts or something like that. Single leg becomes your flexibility / stability training tool to build that newly acquired movement ability in that person's head. So we got the scale from just hold, stretch for a long time, to start incorporating some movement, load it, hold it, let the brain get strong in those positions, to now we're just fully loading, and then we add the dynamic component. Can that person go over and over and over and explore the newly acquired positions under strength demands? And then we can build the capacity. First, you have to have a capacity to move. Then you have to have some endurance, and then you can load the complexity onto it.
So let's say you take someone who is very, very overweight, has worked at a desk, someone who's just massively deconditioned
Why are you looking at me?
Deconditioned in every sense of the word, right? So what you're saying is that a really would you just have someone like just stretching and walking for the first period?
Yes, especially if the person is highly deconditioned, which is why we go through, at the very least, a baseline assessment to figure out what the person's resting heart rate is, what HRV is, what the blood pressure is, what their movement capacity, health history, weight. It all matters. And if you put it in a basket and say, okay, well, this person cannot handle elevated blood pressure because they have no vascular network to be able to sustain any kind of work. I mean, it's heavy. The joints are already being shredded. Why would we do anything else other than
they're a pressure cooker?
I mean, see, in the reality in the world, people think that they need to train, and the perception of training has to be some sort of a train smash, like, oh, I'm just gonna get messed up. But that person can't handle it. It's 315 pounds, heavy in the midline, never done anything for 20 years. What do we expect out of the person? The cardiovascular system cannot recover from a simple set of body weight squats. What you see is the heart rate stays high and just continues for the rest of the workout. Like that's a lack of vascular ability to comply with the demands. So now you got to go give that person ability to sustain the demands that you're going to place with your training. So give them a little bit more healthier blood supply to the joints, to the tendons, to the muscles. Okay. Give them a little bit of stretch, because if the hip cannot open, you can't even walk very well probably, or very brisk or very long. If that calf isn't working, you won't be able to go up and down hills and so forth.
And this is where some of the fitness professionals, and I use that term lightly, and the client themselves will object because they have a body composition goal. Like, I want to lose my, but then we can't forget that there's this huge thing called a diet that will do quite a bit of the work. That
far more than what training can
far
ever
more
do.
than your orange class, and so while we're working on this, ability to move and get physical capabilities up, where the most of the legwork on this body composition thing is going to happen on the diet side anyway. And people will instinctively try to increase their cardio and their training and do 2-a-days and beat themselves down as a get-out-of-jail-free card, so they don't have to spend as much time and care on these important things.
And yet the training is the demanding side of this equation, and nutrition is the supportive side of it. Like, nutrition isn't the demanding part. If you don't have nutrition right, it doesn't matter what training you do. So if your nutrition gets squared, your training is easier.
Yeah.
But to your point about the minimal amount of work that needs to do, the research is fairly clear. You can stretch. Diabetics, in fact, I mean, most people will be hard pushed to train in the gym, but diabetics can get their blood sugar down by simply stretching.
Yeah.
The contraction of the tissues of stretching forces GLUT receptors to the surface of the cell, and the insulin demand goes down instantly. Just by either squeezing your hands, squeezing your butt, that's one, or stretching. Mm-hmm. All you're doing is putting a deformation through the tissues.
Yeah, you're stressing the tissues.
You're stretching the tissues. Brain doesn't know. It says, okay, there's some sort of a stretch going on. I better come up, and then soaks up the blood sugar. And over time, person stretches and does nothing else than maybe meditation, some walk, some stretching, and the blood sugar comes under control. And now the nervous system can relax because the blood sugar is not all over the place. And that person miraculously becomes more flexible.
Yeah, that's because of
God.
That's because of muscle confusion, though, bro.
yeah.
Insulin confusion.
Insulin confusion.
Brain doesn't know if it's high, is it low, but that's how simply we can restore some people who severely deconditioned and they think they need to go to the gym. Like, you don't. Yeah,
you
can
need
do
to
it at home.
Crawl before you butterfly.
Sometimes you just stand. You just stand and flex your butt hard enough for 10 times a day, and then suddenly your butt becomes the biggest thing for blood sugar, and you're better, and then your flexibility restores itself.
Now,
that's my plan.
I was
going to
ask a question on pain, but I think that'd be better for Dr. Quinn.
Yeah, let's try to. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that we can go. Let's kind of go on the training side.
Pain is a very, very different cat.
But along that side of the training side, like there's someone who's going to listen to these shows and be like, Amir said that there's no goal that can't be benefited from meditation. I think he's painted himself into a corner with this one. Aha, you're wrong. What effect does breathing have?
You are wrong.
What effect of breathing? Breathing properly, improperly what effect does that have on flexibility, mobility, if any?
Oh, it can't be understated or overstated.
Oh.
Yeah, the breathing. Like everybody rags on breathing. Oh, I've never seen anybody not being able to breathe. And well, sure, but you can have a breathing that is efficient and inefficient, just like exercise can be inefficient and inefficient. You have 2/3 of your breath coming down from inferior to the ribs action, where your diaphragm gets functioning and your lungs get fully expanded. Or you have a 1/3 where it's the top of your diaphragm and only accessory respiratory muscles work, like your scalenes and everything else that makes your forward head posture more. So you can breathe fast and terrible and still, survive, or you can breathe deeply and actually be mobile and relaxed in the respiratory system. So your ribs can expand fully. Your neck doesn't have to be tensed up. Your head doesn't have to be forward and chin doesn't have to be open because you can't draw enough air into your nose. So to your point, if you're breathing efficiently or quote-unquote inverted breathing via upper lungs, then you ain't going to have any probably flexibility or mobility or ability to get into overhead position because your traps are going to be constantly fired up. Your suboccipital is going to be constantly fired up. Entire neck is going to get locked down from constantly pulling on the rib cage trying to get some air. Vice versa, your lower back is going to get tight because the neck and the back is like a brother and sister holding hands together mechanically from each segment point of view. And if your neck isn't moving very well, lower back is not going to move very well.
Are you saying that everything's connected?
What do you know? Apparently everything is...
You mean things are multifactorial?
Most of the time.
Everything's integrated?
So let's fast forward.
So yes, the breathing is probably of the most critical importance.
And the reason why I bring that up is because it is a part of meditation, But in general, when someone is exercising or stretching, they are and their chances are their breathing will change rate.
And it will be very different. Exercising is a stress breathing. So most people are like, okay, I got 10 reps of this. I'm just going to hanker down. I'm going to hold my breath
for all 10.
Or I'm going to just my eyes are going to be very big and I'm going to just hyperventilate. But one thing that we do at the gym here is, okay, look, get into meditative, like almost breathing approach to exercise. So it'll be some sort of cyclical. It's up and down. It's in and out. It doesn't matter how many reps is there. You got to calm the brain down so the breathing doesn't go up into your upper area. If you're stretching and you're having to hold your breath, I'd say it's probably not stretching anymore. You're probably stressing out the system. So all you do is winding up the nervous system tight and tight. It's like, oh, look at the stretch. I'm going to hold it tight. Okay, so how tight was that? Just too tight. The brain just thinks it's an insult. He's about to tear your leg out. Well, don't do that either.
And so this is just an aside on the breathing side of things, because if you go onto T-Nation and YouTube and whatever, you're going to find information related to the bench press or the deadlift, and that has to do with breathing and bracing and those kinds of things. Because, when you are from a power standpoint, like talking about Olympic weightlifting or things, or, a one-arm deadlift, right? Like that's a much different thing. And so when you talk about, like, for those of you out there who may be reading articles on certain lifts that talk about bracing, holding your breath, that kind of stuff, keep in mind that's different than your traditional.
It's a performance spectrum for you.
Exactly. Yeah, because, Exactly, because again, I remember being in courses where you're being taught about the major lifts like the overhead press and the bench press, and they say, like if the bar is moving, you shouldn't be breathing, but when you're doing, they're talking about powerlifting. So exactly.
Yeah, but it's specific too. Like I'm a big boxing fan, and one of the first things you learn on day one before you even throw the punch is how to breathe when you throw the punch. Mm-hmm. It's like if you listen to them, if you listen and they're not hitting any back, you can hear.
Or you're not going to be throwing any punches very quickly.
Yeah,
you're not going to run out of air. You look white in the face and pass out.
And you're not be able to take any.
Yeah.
So breathing is specific to like activities of daily living, exercise when you're like training for 10 seconds or less in like the 100-meter, or if you're doing a 2-second shot put, or you're doing a 5-mile run. I mean, the scale moves of like how to breathe properly for all that, but it all comes back to learning how to breathe.
It's fair to say that the majority of the people are not aware what the breathing should be like
Yeah.
when a person is relaxed. So the meditation will be feeding very, very well, conscious, unconscious, whatever you want to do. Even walking slowly will force you to kind of appreciate the breath a little bit. But most people can't breathe because life is stressful, and then so everything else gets tighter because of the.
Life is so hard.
Sometimes it can be.
So let's fast forward, assuming people either have a healthy foundation or a reasonable foundation, or they've done the work, like the stretching, the passive stretching, the cardiovascular work, and kind of gotten themselves into a state where they're ready for some loading, to use your term, like you're going to load the tissue a little bit. And what are some things, real practically speaking, from a training standpoint, that are going to, as they go through this process, facilitate continued improvement from a mobility standpoint?
Just had a thought. I got a good one. I hope I don't forget it.
We'll use it now.
Well,
Quickly.
Well, give us a
Let's
keyword.
let's
Give us
start.
a trigger word, and we'll come back to it.
Slow.
Slow. Okay.
Slow. So, what most people are the opposite of slow. They're fast. So they think they need to program hop. They need to do something fast. It's harder. Lift weights faster. Do more. We see the athletes, lifting CrossFit games. You see people move monumental loads over large distances fast and look like a superheroes.
That's CGI though.
Some of it, and smoke and mirrors and all that stuff. But the reality is that these guys have paid their dues, and
And
they're
they
probably
take
going
BCAAs for performance.
zero calorie
Calorie-free
BCAAs.
BCAAs. It's important.
And they might be paying the price. The athletes, they're there for a specific reason. They're there to win the game, not to be better at life in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So most people, and this is one we battled here for a long time, don't appreciate that connective tissue or mobility that is connected to connective tissue health takes time to restore.
Mhm.
Connective tissue takes anywhere
Sorry,
between
one more time.
too many-
Mobility is connected
The
to connective tissue health. Okay.
Right. And the connective tissue health is connected directly to your state of health, your sleep, your hydration, your breathing, and your exposure to specific demands to that connective tissue health. So if you're not doing anything that causes specific adaptation to that connective tissue, then you're not going to expect to get stronger tissues over a longer time. So anywhere between 18 and 24 months when the full turnover happens from a connective tissue health point of view. So you're going to have a new bone every 7 years. You might have a new patellar tendon every 18 to 24 months if you're doing the right things. Now, if you keep hopping around and changing questions, body can't adapt to certain demands. Vice versa, if you're not feeding it right, the connective tissue can't be healthy. And if you're rushing through things, in order for brain to say, okay, this is what I want, it has to be slow enough and long enough and frequent enough where body says, okay, I'm going to deposit a new structure in there because you keep asking me those questions. So the demands has to be somewhat consistent, somewhat long, and somewhat frequent in order for your body to benefit from changes. And that's your mobility getting locked into a new place where patella tendon or Achilles tendon is now strong at the edge of the range of the motion of your ability to control it. That's a true definition of mobility. You can control at the corners of your ability to move, and you're relatively safe. Now, nobody's safe at the edges completely. Injuries will happen. But you're strong at those edges, or stronger than you were before, which means the body can control itself, which means you will be able to go into those ranges as opposed to not, as it was in the past. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big realization. Slow and long in order to develop a new connective tissue is the key in here, which is why the tempo of movement execution matters.
Okay, so
Can't move too fast.
There's two things. So you're talking about long from
macro point of view.
Yeah, so like
months and years and to truly adapt. Like your joint will remold itself. You see with the baseball pitchers, they'll pitch, and the joint will change itself over time. And the young guys coming at the age of 18 and they have a external rotation of 135 degrees or some ridiculous thing. That's because joint has changed the shape because of the continuous demands.
So,
Same thing applies to anything else.
Repetitions, basically.
Repetition,
And
exposure.
in order to have repetitions over a period of time.
You gotta keep.
No one workout is ever going to make permanent change.
No.
So from a macro standpoint, the long thing, but then slow. Now you're talking about tempo of the actual.
That's
movements.
from micro point of view. Every workout, every movement execution causes some sort of adaptation. So if you move things fast, you're gonna have much more stiffening of the tendons.
And that's a protective mechanism.
It's an adaptation. So if you, for example, when you move the heavy load, like in the power clean or clean or snatch fast, the movement of it causes such a elastic energy transfer that tendon will get tighter and tighter in order to transfer the energy from the muscle to tendons to moving segments more. But if you're moving the segments slower, for example, in a squat, you do something like a 5-second eccentric lowering or lowering phase or 10 seconds or whatever. The sliding segments of the connective tissue has to slide past each other, which means they're gonna decouple from each other. And that tendon is going to become more, quote unquote, pliable now. So you're not going to be so stiff. Stiffness is good for certain athletic purposes, but it's not good for others. So if you wanted to move heavy loads fast, you want to have some stiffness in tendons, because then you can transfer the load from muscles through tendons into bony structures. But if you want the tissue to be healthy, you need to have the connective tissue segments sliding past each other without adhering to each other. That's a slower contraction. That's much lower velocity, lowering of the loads or lowering of the segments or whatever that may be. So your squat might be much slower. Your bench press might be, when you're rehabbing, for example, tendon irritation, you might have to bench press much slower in the eccentric phase. Even hold in terms of pauses, because that develops a very different response in the tendinous apparatus than the fast movements. And Quinn is probably going to talk much more about that.
Yeah, it just sounds like you're turning my workout into a wussy hour.
All that breathing and all that stretching, I don't think it needs to be like that. But if
I'm being sarcastic, but
if you can't handle it, I want to write the program that is backwards in order to appease your ego.
No, I'm saying, like,
I get it.
At some point, we forget how we learned stuff when we were younger, with like long and slow, like learning new languages, learning math. At some point, we forgot that that's what it really takes. And then as adults, we have this: I need it now.
Muscle confusion.
Yeah, muscle confusion. I need it now. Balls to the wall. F this, F that.
These three workouts a week will get me shredded over 3 weeks.
And to be fair, I think that from a communication standpoint, like, you can bury someone without picking up a weight, right?
Just put your hand over their mouth and pinch your nose a little bit, and within about 2.5 minutes, you can bury that person.
But I mean, I remember doing like the first time I did some of the muscle activation work from Guy Voyer.
Yeah.
Like you don't do, it's all body weight stuff. You're doing like leg lifts and things like that.
For 100 repetitions.
Yeah, and I remember like hardly being able to walk for like 4 days after. And so I think that, if we're,
and yet you can put 300 pounds on your back, be just fine, and you lift your leg 55 times, and the leg is just absolutely dead.
Yeah, and so for people who are trying to navigate this in their own experience, you got to keep in mind that just because something is lighter or slower, or because you're talking about a 10-second eccentric on a squat, like that's going to be obviously a much lighter load than you would if you're going to do one up, one down, right? And so people associate that with, to Amir's point, the wussy hour. I'm not really getting my money's worth, or it's less bang for my buck because I'm not training as hard, aka the intensity is lowered. But
I also don't want to claim that we are advocating the slow burn Bari or whatever method. That's not validating. Like, that is the way to train. We're talking about just like this whole spectrum of training styles.
We're talking macro view in here.
Yeah.
What the training should look like. We're not going to do 22 repetitions of 10-second leg lift with the toes pointed out. But we will do at some stages of the training program controlled movements that teach the brain something, from the movement control to connective tissue rehabilitation to enough time under tension to cause certain changes. physiologically, like a little bit extra work causes blood sugar to lower down, and what do you know? That person got stronger now, and suddenly they muscle hypertrophy because we spend enough time loading it over time. We spend enough time getting connective tissue addressed, and now they move better. They have less pain, and they're stronger and they're healthier. I don't see a problem. It's all spectrum, right? So we start maybe a little bit slower. Some things you can do slower. Some things you must do faster. Like we do a lot of medicine ball work in here. Fair to say.
Yeah.
That's fairly safe, fairly exciting to people. It's a good athletic preparation. It's like a child back to playing games, and you can't lie. You either can throw the ball and you can't throw the ball. And mobility... Triggered, me too. But all we have to do is figure out what they can do, push that envelope a little bit, what they can't do, and back that up a little bit with something that actually will bring the functionality back up to par or whatever they need to be in life.
And to be fair, like when you talk about, we last week with Brad Schoenfeld, we talked about volume, frequency, and intensity, right? And time under tension is one of the variables that contributes to volume.
Totally.
Right? Like people want to think like volume, that people want to reduce volume to sets and reps, but like the tempo at which you do those sets and reps is also a contributing factor to the volume.
Just try to do, 5 sets of 5 with, bombing down into a squat and coming back up, or 10-second lowering. Like we did yesterday with Robin here, and, neither he nor I can walk very well today.
So let's get a little more granular, like specifics, because I know...
That's a big word. What's that? Triggered.
Stop mansplaining to us, Tyler.
Yeah. So again, I've been following programs that you've written for me.
Since you were young.
Since I was...
I'm sorry. I meant to say younger.
Since I was young. Now that I'm over 30 and I'm not anymore, and I'm past my prime, and now my programs are much more geriatric in nature. I have done split squats with all kinds of variations: front foot elevated, back foot elevated, both feet flat on the ground. I've done a more dynamic in the form of a lunge. You have had me lower for 3 seconds. You've had me lower for 4 seconds. You've had me pause 1 second at the bottom.
Well,
You've had me
pause.
pause second at the top. And so I think that, to your point, like all of these differences that you make are going to create a different adaptation in the tissue. Explain some of those, because to the average person, a 2-second eccentric in a split squat with a pause at the bottom is different than a 2-second eccentric lowering in a split squat with no pause and then a pause at the top. Like that's a seemingly insignificant change. I pause at the bottom or I pause at the top. Like, what's the big difference?
Or didn't pause at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Muscle bump.
Or 3 seconds down with no pause. Either way, like explain to some of those. You say, okay, these all create a different adaptation of the tissue. What is the difference in the different scenarios for some of those variables?
So in my mind, I'm trying to create the movement program in the head, although there isn't a place where programs are getting stored, but we want to have similar movement patterns repeating themselves in the workout. So with a slight variation, maybe foot angle, maybe torso angle, maybe implement. So that's first. We change the movements, but we're not changing them drastically where there is no correlation between one movement and the other completely. So that kind of is always, the rivers runs from left to right if you think like that. We're just slowly going to undulate a little bit. And then when we're changing the tempos, it's just like what we talked about, restoring the mobility. If you strong at certain range and weak at the other range, let's fix the weak range. So most people, by all accounts, are weakest at either side of the range. So if you think about arm, for example, if you take your arm overhead and if you take your arm straight all the way behind you, those two ranges are going to be the weakest. Obviously, when you're standing, you raise your arm, it's easiest for you to raise your arm overhead because the gravity isn't acting. But if I put you horizontal, face on the floor, and ask you to raise straight arm above your head, most people will be, going red but trying to raise the arm because they can't. There's no range of motion in the shoulder. It's not just there is no range of motion. The shoulder doesn't move very well, but there's no strength because you're very, very weak at the edges. The muscles, when they contract, they can't produce enough force at the edges. Either they're very long or they're very short. The force production is low or lower. So what we're trying to do with the pauses or exposing certain ranges of motion is push that curve up a little bit at certain ranges. So for example, in a split squat at the bottom pause, what I'm trying to give you is ability to get stronger at the bottom. So when it comes to loading in the future phases, you have no problem getting down to it slowly under control so you don't break your kneecap or don't strain your back or something. So that's first. So we slowly lower you down. Then you pause. Then you can control yourself at the bottom so you don't jam the knee, you don't, collapse somewhere. And then you can get yourself back out safely. So now when that person is faced with a task in life that requires them to control under load that position, hopefully the brain knows that it's a little bit stronger in that position. So when you get stapled in a pile playing football or something like that, and you get compressed, brain says, okay, I've been there or been in something similar, so I can get myself out of trouble because I have been exposed to that. Is that sort of
yeah.
Does
So
that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, so you're talking about like someone who has an inability to get into a certain range, you do that slowly with a different tempo.
Correct.
And once someone is kind of...
Because if they go fast, they're just going to tank and then bounce, and who knows how, because the repetitions now are traumatic to the tissues we're trying to rehabilitate, potentially. And then if you can't control the edges, you should rebuild the edges first, because that will lift the edges of the curve bell or bell curve. Curve bell, bell curve, same thing.
You're from
Southern Hemisphere,
yeah,
so it's a curve bell, it's a bell curve. And so the chances of getting less injured is potentially higher. So safety is going up because that person now can control the edges of the ability. Now that's the mobility component of it. Strength and flexibility combined together, where they can control themselves at the edges. So now we give them tools to cope with the demands of extra range of motion, if that makes sense.
So, Rolandas, you're like most responsible people in the health and fitness industry, and will to most questions be like, well, it depends on this, it
Always
depends on
depends.
that, always depends.
Such a cop out, bro.
Yeah.
Like I'm all
3
about,
sets of 5.
yeah. 3 sets of
So-
3
5.
sets of 5 and 10 by 10.
Push pull legs.
So when
All
it
the
comes
time,
to
and
when it
buys and
comes to
tries.
training for optimal mobility, give us one dogma that you operate under.
Dogma is such a triggering word.
I know. Well, we're into that here.
I think most people, and I tell almost every single hour student here, is that most people underreact in the long term and overreact in the short term. That applies to nutrition. That applies
That's
to training.
That's a very wise statement. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah.
What did I say?
You said something about dolls.
Triggered. I do believe very strongly that most people overreact over short term and underreact severely over long term.
Explain what that means.
And it's a fairly self-evident, like your weight gain, for example. Most people underreact over 5 years and 10 years, and it's kind of like 10-year gain, 10-pound gain over 5 years, another 10 pounds, like no big deal. And then you reach certain threshold, and like, okay, so next
Juice
4
cleanse.
weeks, all I'm doing is aloe vera and coffee enemas and in far infrared sauna because Dr. Oz and raspberry ketones. That's
Hey, we do not talk about raspberry ketones.
We haven't
we
yet.
should.
Oh my gosh, that's freaking funny.
And
Okay.
and a
yeah,
nicotine
yeah.
chewing gum. So that's overreaction in the short term and massive underreaction in the long term. So there's this asymmetrical perception of what it takes to truly change because of Insta famous and Facebooks and all that stuff. The reality, it takes much, much less effort over a long time, but it will stick versus massive monumental effort that has a much higher rate of recidivism or relapse and going back to originally where we were. So for me, I operate under a paradigm of long and steady versus hard and fast and short, because that is really most of the time it's just causing too much damage in the wake. and people can't sustain. That's your biggest loser. That's your 21-day shreds. That's
Yeah.
almost anything that is time bound and has these massive effort going piled into one side. You change all your nutrition. You don't do nothing in what life resembles like. So you can't integrate into anything. And as such, you have no lasting results because your willpower and your ability to do so will get exhausted in 3 weeks flat or something to that extent. We see this with nutrition. We see this with adherence to lifestyle habits. We see this with training, just the same. So for me, calm down, do more frequently, do less than what you think you should or what Instagram tells you. Not our Instagram, obviously, because it's a different smart, but less, more frequently, and longer course, longer trajectory. Pick a fight and then stay with it, because plan B doesn't exist. I talk to people like, what are you going to do? Not train? That's a bad plan. Oh, I'm going to try and, different color workout regime, that maybe starts with 90 and ends with
I ditched my Orange Theory for yellow facts,
or something, and that's jumping around without having a paradigm in your mind. Your mind should be to get better movement, better health in the tissues, better health overall. Do that. Day-to-day things won't matter anywhere near as much, but 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months will make a difference.
I want to make sure for anyone listening who,
and I can't repeat that again, by the way,
who might be a little bit thick, like realizing.
What do you mean, like thick-waisted or thick?
No, thick
side,
yeah,
thick skulled,
thick thighs,
thick skulled, right? So we're hearing the same thing. So that's a great observation and a good way of putting it, and it's similar to and we don't tell other guests on the show what to say, right? We're not like feeding them lines.
You didn't give me a question, nothing.
Yeah.
I was like, just come in.
But so Brad Schoenfeld last week says, "Oh yeah, like muscle gain, maybe a pound a month."
Yeah.
Right? He's talking about you have
legitimate muscle gain.
Legitimate muscle gain. You have James Lawrence, right? The Iron Cowboy. Remember a couple months back we interviewed him, and his thing was it all comes down to lots of little things over a long period of time. That was his one thing, is lots of and you have Krista Scott Dixon, to your point about overreacting in the short term. Her number one dogma, she said, was what? Don't be crazy.
Oh yeah,
Don't be crazy.
She's like, we're like, what's the number one nutrition advice you have? She's like, just don't be crazy. So
don't be stupid.
That's a good point. Obviously, from a mobility standpoint, but anything is all about long term, lots of little things, right? What was the caloric surplus for muscle mass gain?
200-300
calories. It's not like slamming.
One extra In-N-Out patty.
Yeah.
All the gains.
Yeah, you can go through the drive-thru. I just want one patty, please.
No, 6 at least.
Oh, because you normally get 5.
100 grams of protein. That's I've done my math. That's about 100 grams of protein, so we're good.
Now, when you take this approach that you're talking about, not being crazy and thinking long term and not overreacting and underreacting in the wrong context,
that's a crazy approach, right there.
The crazy cycle. When you do it correctly, the maintenance of these new attributes are easier than the acquisition of these attributes.
Totally.
Right? So what I mean by that is like getting there might be this, effort.
Hard task. Yeah.
Hard task, but maintaining that once you're there, as long as you're participating in this process properly versus this kind of run and gun, I'm going to get there in 4 weeks kind of thing. It's easier to maintain those attributes, whether it's muscle gain, whether it's body composition, like maintain my new ideal weight, or mobility, would you say?
It takes a very small amount of influence on the body to stay where it is.
Yeah.
But it takes quite an effort sometimes to get to where you want to be.
To get to where it needs to be, yeah.
Just like acquiring a certain amount of wealth is a challenge. Once it reaches certain threshold, unfortunately, it starts to feed itself quite drastically. So if you're not stupid, to your point, and you're not doing crazy things.
Yeah, the word wealth triggers me, though.
Should well, think about something else that doesn't trigger you today.
I have relational wealth.
Lots of relationships?
Yeah. Thanks, Rolandas, for sharing with us today. You're a cool cat, smart guy, good friend. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work with you.
Well, I appreciate being here.
Jessica, what do you got for us?
I like the way you move. Da-na-na. I like that's all the one part.
What about that? What about this one? What about this one? I like to move it. I like
That
to
was
move
my-
it,
that
move
was
it.
my
Hey, he
second
sounds
option.
just like the meerkat from
I like to
Madagascar.
move it. You like to
Move it.
move it. And on that note.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all next week.